Appendix V. Inter-Treaty Declaration on Infant and Young Child Feeding 2005, World Health Organization and UNICEF 2005. In the 15 years since the adoption of the original Inter-Treaty Declaration in 1990, remarkable progress has been made in improving infant and young child feeding practices worldwide. Nevertheless, inappropriate feeding practices, suboptimal or no breastfeeding, and inadequate complementary feeding remain the greatest threat to child health and survival globally. Improved breastfeeding alone could save the lives of more than 3,500 children every day, more than any other preventive intervention. Guided by accepted human rights principles, especially those embodied in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, our vision is of an environment that enables mothers, families, and other caregivers to make informed decisions about optimal feeding, which is defined as exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, followed by the introduction of appropriate complementary feeding and continuation of breastfeeding for up to 2 years of age or beyond. Achieving this vision requires skilled practical support to arrive at the highest attainable standard of health and development for infants and young children, which is the universal right of every child. Challenges remain: poverty, the HIV pandemic, natural and human-made emergencies, globalization, environmental contamination, health systems investing primarily in curative rather than preventative services, gender inequities, and women's increasing rates of employment outside the home, including in the non-formal sector. These challenges must be addressed to achieve the Millennium Development Goals and the aims of the Millennium Declaration, and for the vision set out above to become reality for all children. The targets of the 1990 Inter-Treaty Declaration and the 2002 Global Strategy for Infant and Young Child Feeding remain the foundation for action. While remarkable progress has been made, much more needs to be done. We therefore issue this call for action so that all parties empower women in their own right and as mothers and providers of breastfeeding support and information to other women. Support breastfeeding as the norm for feeding infants and young children. Highlight the risks of artificial feeding and the implications for health and development throughout the life course. Ensure the health and nutritional status of women throughout all stages of life. Protect breastfeeding in emergencies, including supporting uninterrupted breastfeeding and appropriate complementary feeding and avoiding general distribution of breast milk substitutes. Implement the HIV and infant feeding framework for priority action, including protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding for the general population while providing counseling and support for HIV-positive women. All governments establish or strengthen national infant and young child feeding and breastfeeding authorities, coordinating committees, and oversight groups that are free from the commercial influence and other conflicts of interest. Revitalize the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, BFHI, maintaining the global criteria as the minimum requirement for all facilities, expanding the initiative's application to include maternity, neonatal, and child health services, and community-based support for lactating women and caregivers of young children. Implement all provisions of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and subsequent relevant World Health Assembly resolutions in their entirety as a minimum requirement, and establish sustainable enforcement mechanisms to prevent and/or address noncompliance. Adopt maternity protection legislation and other measures that facilitate 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding for women employed in all sectors, with urgent attention to the non-formal sector. Ensure that appropriate guidelines and skill acquisition regarding infant and young child feeding are included in both pre-service and in-service training of all healthcare staff to enable them to implement infant and young child feeding policies and to provide a high standard of breastfeeding management and counseling to support mothers toward optimal breastfeeding and complementary feeding. Ensure that all mothers are aware of their rights and have access to support, information, counseling in breastfeeding and complementary feeding from health workers and peer groups. Establish sustainable systems for monitoring infant and young child feeding patterns and trends and use this information for advocacy and programming. Encourage the media to provide positive image of optimal infant and young child feeding, support breastfeeding as the norm, and participate in social activities such as World Breastfeeding Week. take measures to protect populations, especially pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, from environmental contaminants and chemical residues. Identify and allocate sufficient resources to fully implement actions called for in the global strategy for infant and young child feeding. Monitor progress in appropriate infant and young child feeding practices and report periodically, including as provided in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. All manufacturers and distributors of products within the scope of the International Code. Encourage full compliance with all provisions of the International Code and subsequent relevant World Health Assembly resolutions in all countries, independently of any other measures taken to implement the code. Ensure that all processed foods for infants and young children meet applicable Codex Alimentarius standards. Multilateral, bilateral, and international financial institutions. Recognize that optimal breastfeeding and complementary feedings are essential to achieving the long-term physical, intellectual, and emotional health of all populations, and therefore the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals and other development initiatives, and that inappropriate feeding practices and their consequences are major obstacles to poverty reduction and sustainable socioeconomic development. Identify and budget for sufficient financial resources and expertise to support governments in formulating, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating their policies and programs on optimal infant and young child feeding, including the BFHI. Increase technical guidance and support for national capacity building in all target areas set forth in a global strategy for infant and young child feeding. Support operational research to fill information gaps and improve programming. Encourage the inclusion of programs to improve breastfeeding and complementary feeding in poverty reduction strategies and health sector development plans. Public interest non-governmental organizations. Give greater priority to protecting, promoting, and supporting optimal feeding practices, including relevant training of health and community workers, and increase effectiveness through cooperation and mutual support. Draw attention to activities that are incompatible with the code's principles and aims so that violations can be effectively addressed in accordance with national legislation, regulations, or with other suitable measures. And that is the end of Appendix V.